Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always, there's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away by the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. Try not to do snark, I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation of just how difficult it is to get a film made. And that's enough preamble, isn't it, really? I'm going back to 1999. We're going to genetically modified sharks. We're going to mayhem. We're going to Samuel L. Jackson. We're going to this.
Tell me, Mr. Franklin, have you ever known anyone with Alzheimer's?
No.
What if you could end all that suffering with a single pill? Give me till Monday morning, 48 hours. I'll give you results that'll skyrocket your stock price.
In the most advanced research facility in the world.
Wow.
Beneath its glassy surface, a world of gliding monsters.
A team of specialists is working against the clock.
Did someone order the fish?
On an experiment to benefit mankind.
Sharks never show any loss of brain activity as they age.
We're this close to the reactivation of a human brain cell.
But before they can save millions of lives...
Tell me I didn't see that. They recognize that gun.
That's impossible. Sharks do not swim backwards. They can't.
They'll have to find a way to save their own.
That then was a clip from the uproarious 1999 sci-fi horror Deep Blue Sea, directed by Rennie Harlin, written by Duncan Kennedy, Donna Powers and Wayne Powers, starring Saffron Burrows, Thomas Jane, LL Cool J, Jacqueline Mackenzie, Michael Rappaport, Stellan Skarsgård and, of course, Samuel L. Jackson. Story of Deep Blue Sea goes back to Queensland, Australia, and a young man called Duncan Kennedy. In fact, it was an incident as a small child that lit the spark for the film that would follow many decades later, because Kennedy recalled that when he was a child, he saw the impact of a real shark attack on someone near where he lived. And as he would recall in an interview with the Los Angeles Times, there's no way around this, really not that much left of him. He would do a very extensive conversation with the website Bloody Disgusting, which I'm going to reference a few times throughout this episode. And he talked even more about that incident, describing how I remember it in great detail. Limbs bitten off, sorry if you're having breakfast. Police officer with pants rolled up pulling the pale body onto the beach. And Kennedy said how this gave him, unsurprisingly, recurring nightmares. But in his case, they were nightmares of being chased in chest-deep flooded hallways where he could move but not fast enough by sharks that were always one step ahead of me. Now, the memory of the incident and the dream would stick with him, and over time he began to put this into words. He went through film school and started writing scripts, and even though Deep Blue Sea would be his first produced screenplay, it wouldn't be the first one that he wrote or wouldn't be the first one that he nearly got made. But it was in his mid-20s when he eventually finished a script by the name of Deep Red, a screenplay that was quite different from the eventual Deep Blue Sea, albeit with similar themes running through it. Now, this was his third script, but as he explained to Bloody Disgusting, the actual treatment and screenplay for Deep Blue Sea, I'll call it that rather than Deep Red, that's a very different film, took about 4 weeks each. And he put in his work researching it. He said, I spent weeks talking to scientists at places, including Moat Marine Lab, covering shark physiology. And then he was investigating and talking to people involved with the then scientifically groundbreaking squalor mine cancer research. And he said they agreed to talk because I presented Deep Blue Sea sharks as man-made, unlike Jaws, which demonised natural sharks. Now, at some point, I will come to Jaws on this podcast. I've done Jaws 3D, but Spielberg has spoken, Steven Spielberg, director of Jaws, of course, has spoken in fairly recent times about how he regrets the depiction of sharks in Jaws, that it demonised the creatures. And Kennedy was kind of sidestepping that, but also he was very, very wary that the shadow of Jaws was all over anyone who tries to make any kind of shark film. So, Kennedy had attended film school in California and got working on motion pictures. That he did some design work on Terminator 2, designing some of the props in that. And he got to meet a director by the name of Stephen Hopkins. Now, Hopkins directed films like The Ghost and the Darkness, for instance, and Blown Away. And I think he was the director on the first season of the huge hit TV series 24 as well. And so Kennedy was talking to Hopkins, told him about the script, and then Hopkins then got the script to his producer, a man called Lloyd Segan. Segan then, it's like a bit of a daisy chain, this passed it along to a pair of talent agents at the company Paradigm, and through Paradigm the script then in late 1994 landed with the producing team of Alan Rich and Tony Ludwig. Now, they received it as a screenplay that had been written on spec. No one had paid for it. It was something done entirely off the writer's own back and put out to market. And they said, we got that. They say actually in the press notes for the film, we got this great script about sharks and we hadn't read or heard anything like it, well, since Jaws. And they described the difference. They said in that film, the shark was in its own environment. In Deep Blue Sea, through a series of occurrences, the sharks are now in our environment. So the basic premise is, what if these monsters were suddenly stalking us where we live? And so that set a couple of questions over tone, which I'll come to shortly. But with Rich and Ludwig interested and on board, they then took it to Warner Brothers. And there were a couple of bidders in for the film, but by the middle of 1995, Warner Brothers had secured the option on the script and wanted to make it. To make sure it could make it, it brought in a writer-producer it was working with at the time, a man called Akiva Goldsman. Goldsman would memorably write Batman and Robin, and then a few years later win a best screenplay Oscar for A Beautiful Mind. But Goldsman was approached by Warner Brothers to come in to help develop it and really help press the film forward. That Warner Brothers had acquired the film, it would quite like to make it. However, it's not just Jaws' shadow that was over Deep Blue Sea. There was also the backdrop of 1995's Waterworld. Now, Waterworld was just about coming out when Warner Brothers snapped up the Deep Blue Sea script, but Waterworld was reinforcing lessons to Hollywood that Hollywood was well aware of. You do not shoot films on water. That costs on the ocean. That costs an absolute raging fortune. In fact, anything with water in it, if it's not been drunk, you need to at least have a conversation with it. The executives at Universal Pictures had seen how the budget for Waterworld had absolutely ballooned, and it wasn't really until the middle of 1995 when Waterworld came out in cinemas and was a modest hit, not the turkey that some people describe it as. It was a modest hit and a profitable one, that I would imagine it greased the wheels a little bit within Warner Brothers HQ. There was, though, a couple of years of development ahead, that even though Warner Brothers had picked the script up, it wasn't a mad rush to the finish line. And it languished a little bit, but with active development ongoing, that several writers were brought in to work on the screenplay for the film, most of them not credited. Amongst those who were involved were Simon Barry, Charlie Mitchell, Donna and Wayne Powers, who would get credit. Carty Torkington did some uncredited work on it. Goldsman himself came in, as well as being a producer. He came in and did a polish that got it very, very close to production. There were rumours that Simon Kinberg, he of the X-Men films, had done a pass on it, but Duncan Kennedy would say he'd never seen that. He was unaware of that. But what was interesting about the rewrites was that Kennedy wasn't kept entirely at arm's length, that a lot of the time the original writer is happily dispensed with by Hollywood as different people are come in, and what you end up with is a script that bears very little relation to what they originally started out with. But Kennedy was being invited to give notes on the drafts, and duly did so. He was quite happy to do so. And so eventually a draft of the script, as well as Kennedy's notes on it, ended up in front of the eyes of a director by the name of Rennie Harlin. Now, Harlin had had a bit of a 1990s. I'll come to it shortly. But the script that was in front of him, well, the project had moved on a little bit because Kennedy described one iteration of the screenplay he saw as Jurassic Park meets Jaws. That sort of made some degree of sense. But then there was a competing influence being brought in by other writers that actually shouldn't this be a bit more alien than Jaws and Jurassic Park? Because at heart, what you have with the setup of Deep Blue Sea is an isolated crew, and then you have a creature just picking them off one at a time. And he said, Kennedy would describe how the first notes from Warner Brothers included the need to shift more action that had been on or in ocean water into dark corridors, and to make the facility's interior in the film much more the sole central focus. Now, there was a storytelling benefit to that, but also there was a clear financial benefit to that, because get it off the ocean seemed like a far more economic way to make the film. What this meant is that a facility that Kennedy had written into his script became more and more important to the film as it evolved, that it became, in his words, a mega ocean space station, way larger, more sci-fi, and in much deeper, darker ocean. We've seen that fairly recently with the two Meg films. Harlin's 1990s. Let's just touch on this. So Rennie Harlin started the decade with a double bill of two films that came out the same year. The Adventures of Ford Farlane was one, and then at the time, the most expensive film of all time, Die Hard 2, Die Harder. Now, Die Hard 2 was a very difficult production, as I've covered before on this podcast, and it meant that Harlin was really given the currency to go off and make big films, that he could handle big movies, he could handle big budgets, and he could deliver a film on time. And then he followed up Die Hard 2 with the hugely taxing production that was Cliffhanger. Now, the Sylvester Stallone headline movie of 1993 would be the film that reinvigorated Stallone's career for the second or third time at that point. And again, a very incredible film to look at, really, Cliffhanger, and Harlin's reputation was only enhanced. It took stumbles, though, because then he took on Cutthroat Island, a notorious film which I'll come to shortly on this podcast, that sank the mega budget studio Carolco, the big independent. From there, he was also on The Long Kiss Goodnight, a film that was famous for the cost of its spec script written by Shane Black. And when The Long Kiss Goodnight, which also co-starred Samuel L. Jackson alongside Gina Davis, didn't do huge box office dollars, it left Harlin as a director who proven that he could deliver films of size, but also at the point the script for Deep Blue Sea came his way, his last two films hadn't been hits. One of them, in fact, had been a notable financial failure. Still, Harlin was remaining on the Rolodex as one of Hollywood's go-to action directors, and he was interested, and with him interested, well, Warner Brothers now was inclined to get its checkbook out. It got a director. Harlin could work with Kennedy and could work with Akiva Goldsman and get to a shooting script, and this meant that Warner Brothers was giving all indication the film was moving forward. And so Kennedy was still closely involved. He would describe how closer to production I helped to brainstorm ideas for sequences that weren't working, sometimes even did sketches or storyboards, as well as later stuff like teaser, poster, marketing concepts. And in fact, Kennedy's involvement would go right, this is so unusual for a writer, which is why I bring it up, it would go right to the point of release. He said, even the week of release, I had conversations with Akiva Goldsman about marketing ideas. He would go, one of his suggestions was doing interviews with people going to the beach in Los Angeles, asking them, have you seen Deep Blue Sea, for TV adverts that would play for the film. And so what he was trying to do, he would reconcile at that point, was trying for a little bit more of the beach and ocean visual alongside the ads that were going out for Deep Blue Sea at that point. But also there was that almost schizophrenic mix of Alien and Jurassic Park and Jaws that never fully reconciled in the film, that these tones were slightly mashing, that made it a bit of a more challenging film to sell than perhaps it should have been. Still, let's go back to the pre-production, because that was getting underway a good year before the production began. It was very clear now this was going forward, and the challenge was, how on earth do you realise the sharks? Well, if you go to the production stories of Jaws, you had an infamously malfunctioning shark called Bruce, a mechanical shark, and so oftentimes they would just show small bits of it, almost out of necessity as much as anything else. What they had in Deep Blue Sea was, I mean, inverted commas, clever sharks, that their sharks were going to have enhanced intelligence. They were going to work kitchen appliances, and if you've not seen the film, what a treat you're in for. And so they were working out, how on earth do you realise these sharks? I mean, do you do them with computers? Jurassic Park had shown the way there. Or do you do something a little more practical? And so what they did is they brought together a bunch of people who were really good at creating animals for the big screen. And so a production designer by the name of William Sandell, a shark action supervisor called Walt Conti, Jeffrey Oken on visual effects, and special effects, different to visual effects of course, John Richardson. What they did between them is, well, they watched a lot of shark videos for a start, and they went down to very granular frame-by-frame analysis of how a shark moved. What they really wanted to capture was the contrast of energy, the slowness of a shark as it makes its way through the water against the sudden burst of energy when they go for their prey. They knew, again, that they were going to get compared to Jaws. They knew it. And they knew also they had more technology than Steven Spielberg had when he was making Jaws. Now, it's the old thing. The fact that Spielberg was up against so many barriers is what, in many ways, helped contribute to make Jaws so special. And so perhaps there was an argument you might be working with slightly too many tools. But what they decided to do was, instead of focusing on so many close-up moments, such as a shark bite, the ethos was, wherever possible, show the whole shark. The whole thing. Now, this meant they needed to put together several sharks for the production of the film. In the end, Deep Blue Sea used 4.5 sharks, I'd love to see the half, throughout its physical production. And so while all that was going on, it was the casting that was then also being worked on in tandem. And here again is where they took further inspiration from 1979's Alien. Now, Ridley Scott's a science fiction classic is notable because it cast actors, not stars. That obviously Sigourney Weaver, off the back of the film, would be on a path to superstardom, but she was not a star at that point. She was part of an ensemble. And so what Harlin decided he wanted at least one recognisable performer to anchor the movie, but he didn't need an outright movie star. And then he wanted a bunch of actors of various degrees of profile, really, but to have a kind of every person feel to the cast of the film. So in terms of the recognisable performer, Harlin pushed hard for Samuel L. Jackson. Now, Jackson was originally offered a different role in the film, as it happened. The role that he was originally going to play was eventually taken on by LL Cool J in the final movie, but Jackson's agent just felt it wasn't big enough for him in the first instance, and so a different role was slightly retooled. Samuel L. Jackson agreed to sign on the dotted line. And then, I mean, you look at the rest of the cast and how that came together. I mean, Thomas Jane, for instance, was just working on a bunch of indie films when he got the call. Saffron Burrows, this was going to be one of her biggest films to that point. She'd appeared in Circle of Friends, for instance, and the Wing Commander movie. Crikey, there is a story and a half as well. But you look down the ensemble, and it's people you sort of knew, Michael Rapaport, Stellan Skarsgård, but not the kind of people who open a movie single-handedly. Everything was coming together, and the shoot could begin on August the 3rd, 1998. It was also heading into production with a sizable budget as well, that Harlin and his team had about $80 million to work with. And Harlin knew what he wanted as well. I mean, he talks about this on the extensive DVD extras. I mean, Deep Blue Sea was a brilliant early DVD release. And he says on there how my whole approach to this movie was no more hiding sharks. He said, this time you're really going to see them. And that's a challenge. We've seen sharks on the Discovery Channel. We know what they look like. So our sharks had to be totally convincing. The film thus went to Mexico to film, setting up at Baja Studios in the country, and this is where tanks had been constructed so that James Cameron could shoot Titanic just a year or two before. Titanic, of course, a film shot on water that had gone horrifically over budget, again one for a future episode of Film Stories, but had done a lot of pathfinding and left behind a studio facility that Deep Blue Sea would happily take advantage of. Now, they built lots of sets. Some of them in this case were actually built on top of the massive water tanks at the studios, but also with the facility there that they could submerge them. Not everything underwater was filmed on those tanks, though. That on some occasions they went to a fairly standard soundstage, and what they did is they put fish tanks around the outside of the soundstage so that you'd have windows out of the facility that the actors were in, and it just made it look like they were underwater, where actually they're in a nice cosy film studio. Harlin and his team were deploying a mix of animatronic and CG sharks, and I mean, it's worth noting that once the main shoot was done, Harlin was insistent that they had to go off and shoot real sharks as well. They had to get proper footage of proper sharks, and they went to the Bahamas to do that, and Harlin did insist they go and do that, and what do you know, he ended up in the Bahamas for doing it. If I was making a film, I too, just for the record, would insist that a sequence would need to be shot in the Bahamas. Thomas Jane has given interviews where he talked about the difficulty of the film, and he just said the first day he was on shooting it, I was in a cage, and he said the next day they swam me 30 feet down, then this guy yanks the breather off me and the water's churning with blood and guts and stuff, and he just talked about how it was so terrifying that I just don't want to remember it. Samuel L. Jackson, meanwhile, gave an interview to the Las Vegas Sun around the release of the movie, and he was questioned there, how close did you get to the mechanical sharks that they were using in the film? And he just very. And he said when they first brought it into the lab, we were all in awe of the size of this machine. And he described it as being about 40 feet long, a real monster. He said, I'd walk up to it slowly and touch it, and they said it felt like a real shark. The gills were moving on it. It had a mind of its own sometimes. And when Rennie Harlin would yell cut, sometimes the guys couldn't get it to stop moving. And we all wondered about that. What's going on up there? He talked about it would jump when it wasn't supposed to. And he just described how it was interesting to be around it and how it kept it on your toes. Now, if you've seen Deep Blue Sea, you will know about one particular moment designed to run-foot audiences. This is a spoiler-free podcast, so I can't go into that in detail, because if you've never seen the film, it is a moment. We all know which one it is as well, those of us who've seen the film. But he was deliberate from the start that he wanted to do that Rennie Harlin wanted to put in a moment that would really keep the audience on their toes, and the actor concerned was very much involved in that too. Harlin would also argue that in the end, and this is the man who made Cliffhanger Up Massive Mountains, Deep Blue Sea was the hardest film that he ever made across his entire career. And he's still making films now, actually. He's just released The Bricklayer. That's one of his. But he said because it was all water, and he said maybe 80 shooting days we were standing in the water or we were underwater. And he just said the practicality of just putting a wetsuit on in the morning, being in the water all day. Your script and all your paperwork has to be made of plastic paper. Things that you wouldn't think would ever float, they float. And so you put some water into the set. All of a sudden the table's floating away and the furniture's going somewhere. Or then things that you hope would float actually sink and you can't find them anywhere. And then he talked about how in the midst of this as well, you're controlling mechanical sharks and you're dealing with digital sharks. Now, he wasn't grumbling about it. He said, I enjoyed it. I loved the challenge of something like that. But he did reconcile in the end. It was very hard to put it all together. It was quite a long shoot as well. I mean, it started it began filming at the beginning of August 1998. It didn't finish until November the 5th, 1998. So a good few months of this in not particularly pleasant conditions. And then it was into post-production. It was into the edit, which was coming together quite nicely. And also, it's just like, how on earth do you promote it? Well, one nice line that Kennedy came out with, going back to him, him in the promotion of the film was he was talking in an interview about the problem with approaching a shark movie is how do you do it without repeating Jaws. And one of the things he revealed just ahead of Deep Blue Sea's release, he said in Jaws the shark was 25 feet long, and so Rennie Harlin decided to make the shark in Deep Blue Sea, guess what, 26 feet long. Test screenings then took place for the movie as it was heading towards a summer 1999 release, and test screenings led to a change in the fate of one of the characters. Again, quite spoiler free, but let's just say there was one character. There's quite a long article online that you'll find where Duncan Kennedy explains the original ending and the plot of Deep Blue Sea, and in that there's one character who we do not see make it to the end of the film, who originally does make it to the end of the film. And this was because the test audiences, what a brutal bunch this lot were, decided that they wanted to see that character die. Now this required reshoots very, very late in the day actually, and I say this quite a lot. This is the era of physical film distribution. You didn't send a file to a projector, you didn't send a physical hard drive around or something like that. This was reels of film, and so there was a lock-off point of when you had to finish your movie so that the film could be duplicated, put in cans, distributed around the country. In this case, it still meant a month before the film was in cinemas, a new ending was put in, and what they did was they had to go to the tank at Universal Studios for a single extra day of filming to get the footage that they wanted. Into the promotional period of the film, they were at that point, and Warner Brothers was really insistent that everybody played down Jaws comparisons. It was on a bit of a hiding to nothing there. It didn't stop lots of people asking about Jaws. It didn't stop lots of reviewers writing about Jaws. But Warner Brothers was telling its cast, was telling its creatives, don't talk about Jaws, talk about Deep Blue Sea. And so it went in front of critics who talked about Jaws, and inevitably, I mean, the comparison didn't hold. Yeah, water. Deep Blue Sea was praised, it's worth noting. It's praised for its B-movie qualities as much as anything else. That a lot of fun, but also it's not Jaws. And you go down review after review after review. And while there was praise for the film, there was also a reasonable amount of writing about what the movie wasn't. And in fact, one or two instances of where the fact that it had a kind of B-movie heart to it was quite criticised, which I thought was a little bit odd. That notwithstanding, in the movie went into American cinemas July the 30th to August the 1st, 1999 was the opening weekend. And 1999 was an amazing year for movies, but also a hugely competitive one for blockbuster movies. I mean, you just have to look down the chart at some of the other films that were still playing when Deep Blue Sea landed at the end of July in 1999. I mean, the number one movie was Runaway Bride that year, that particular week. The reunion of Julia Roberts and Richard Gere. I didn't like Runaway Bride actually, but 35 million opening weekend, and that was in the top spot. Deep Blue Sea though, not shabby, 19.1 million, which got it to third place. It would have got to second place were it not for the expansion in release of a film called The Blair Witch Project, which had been playing on a handful of screens for its first 2 weeks of release. Suddenly that screen count had gone right up, and The Blair Witch Project had just rocketed up to second place with 29 million on its third weekend out. Other films that are around, I mean, The Haunting from director Jan de Bont was in fourth place. A bit of an odd film there. There was a much better film in there. Inspector Gadget, not a well-reviewed film, but was doing decent money and also has a great James Bond villain gags in its end credits if you're looking to find like upsides to not always particularly strong films. But look at the other movies that are about. American Pie was 4 weeks in, making money. Eyes Wide Shut, 3 weeks in, making money. Adam Sandler scored a monster hit that summer with Big Daddy. Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, nearly 3 months it had been out at that point, still in the top 10. Disney's Tarzan, great film that is, love Disney's Tarzan, still in the top 10 after nearly 2 months. Wild Wild West had dropped out. Austin Powers, The Spy Who Shagged Me had dropped out. The South Park movie, Notting Hill, The Matrix, The Mummy, and a lot of these films were hanging around for a lot longer than you would expect from a summer blockbuster. The following week, I mean, it's just bad luck, really, that a monster hit of the year came out, doing far bigger business than anticipated. That would be The Sixth Sense. So Deep Blue Sea is by then down to 5th place, still making decent money, but it's also up against the Thomas Crown Affair opened, Mystery Men opened, the Iron Giant opened. I mean, what a week. In fact, if you go to 12th place, a film called Dick from director Andrew Fleming opened, and that's a really good film as well. And the competition for a late July, August release window was surprisingly intense. Bowfinger turned up the week after. Bowfinger is great film. And so Deep Blue Sea, I mean, it had its work cut out to hang around, but hang around for a while it did. By the time it left American cinemas, it had helped itself to $73.6 million, a decent result. Nearly covered its production budget. I know it doesn't work that as soon as the production's budget is covered, it's in profit, but still not a bad way to start, especially when you consider that sharks sell $91 million around the world as well. By the time Deep Blue Sea left cinemas, 164 million it had done in takings just around the globe. And then it would take advantage of the then nascent DVD format. With Warner Brothers was one of the first studios to really back DVDs with proper special features, and it went hell for leather on Deep Blue Sea and was rewarded with a film that sold a lot of copies. I remember actually the UK release of Deep Blue Sea came a little while after the American one. And so I could order the DVD, I think, while it was still playing in cinemas, or had just left. It was something like that. A really good disc, that as well. But then, as would come to be appreciated more and more over time, Deep Blue Sea is a really fun film. That there was an argument put forward. I think it was Wired magazine put forward that it was the best non-Jaws shark film of all time, and it is an awful lot of fun as well. And to the point where its reputation for just sheer entertainment kept the eyeballs on the film, to the point where 2 sequels followed. Now, these were low budget straight to DVD sequels, but if you'd have asked anyone really in 2002, for instance, 3 years after the release of Deep Blue Sea, do you reckon there'll be a Deep Blue Sea 2 in 2018? Do you think there'll be a Deep Blue Sea 3 in 2020? I don't think many people would have suggested that would be the case. I mean, Rennie Harlin involved with none of them. That notwithstanding, Deep Blue Sea would give him a hit. It would really give him a bit more rocket power again to his career, and he would go from this particular movie to Sylvester Stallone again, a movie called Driven, and that's worth having a look at in its own right as well. As we sit here now, though, in 2024, I mean, more and more films have been willing to come out of the shadow of Jaws and just have a go at the monster in the water. I mean, I mentioned the Meg movies, for instance. The Shallows as one. 47 Meters Down proved to be a big indie success back in 2017. And, with no more Jaws films on the horizon, perhaps ever, after the infamous Jaws: The Revenge, I think most people would agree that in the aftermath of Jaws, Deep Blue Sea is probably about as good as we got, and it's still to this day, I would suggest, really good fun. If you like this podcast, I mean, thank you for listening to it. Thank you for lending it your ears. If you would like to support it a little bit more, you can support it financially by going to patreon.com/SimonBrew. If you put some coins in the pot there, you get the podcast early, you get it ad-free, you find out what we're up to behind the scenes. Costing you nothing is to leave a review at your podcast home of choice. I have just this week uncovered a whole bunch of comments that have popped up on Spotify that I didn't know existed. I'm so sorry, but thank you to everyone who's left really lovely comments there. That was very, very heartwarming. If you don't mind leaving a hugely positive review, that helps independent podcasts enormously. And likewise, if you could subscribe at your podcast home of choice, that is much appreciated. If you love print film magazines as much as I do, perhaps you might consider, well, buy mine. Film Stories magazine, leading on the story of the Bob Marley biopic, but with a whole bunch more inside as well, is on sale now at store.filmstories.co.uk. It's the UK's biggest film magazine. It is 168 pages. Film magazines like they used to be, that kind of size, and we've kind of done that again. And thank you to everyone who supports us. And thank you to everyone who supports Film Junior magazine as well. Hugely proud of it. A magazine for under 15s, a print film magazine for under 15s. Who would be mad enough to do that, that would be me. You can find it at store.filmstories.co.uk. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you so much for your time. If I've not bored you completely, then you can find more from me on Twitter, whatever it's called, and Blue Sky at Simon Brew. Film Stories is the handle at Film Stories is actually the handle for Film Stories. Should be surprised to hear. We're at Facebook, facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, youtube.com/filmstories. Our website is filmstories.co.uk. It's got films, games, that's got TV, it's got reviews, news, it's got features, it's got mischief. We're trying to be a clickbait-free website, which is very, very hard to do, given that you're just relying on word of mouth to get people to your website. Thank you to everybody who's supporting us there. But I think I've bored you enough. I am going to leave you in peace and thank you for your time. I'm going to watch a load more films now. I'm going to come back with a load more stories. The main thing until then is you all take care and you look after yourselves, and I will be back soon with some more film stories. Bye bye.